The wind that day wasn't ordinary. It came in sharp, erratic bursts, as if it carried warnings instead of weather. The sky above the New England coast was smeared with shades of iron and blue, and gulls wheeled silently overhead, uneasy in the stillness before the next gust. On the edge of that salted shore, where the rocks sliced up through the beach like buried ribs, Thomas and Eleanor Whitmore found him. A boy, soaked to the skin, barely 6 years old, barefoot and silent, sitting with his knees pulled to his chest beside a washed-up crate and a tangled mess of fishing net. His hair was dark and thick, clinging to his pale forehead. His eyes were open but glassy, unblinking, staring straight into the sea. He didn't cry, he didn't speak, and there were no footprints around him, none leading to or from the boy, just the foamy trail of tide behind his back. Eleanor, trembling, knelt beside him. "Sweetheart, where are your parents?" Nothing. Thomas looked up and down the coastline. The morning mist hadn't yet cleared, but there were no boats, no wreckage, no signs of struggle, just that heavy fog crawling over the Atlantic like a living thing. The boy turned his head slowly, his lips parted, not to speak, but to breathe as if tasting the air. Then he blinked for the first time and faintly nodded toward Eleanor, like he recognized her from a dream. They took him home. No one ever came looking for him, not that day, not the next week, not ever. They named him Jonas, and in their quiet coastal town of Coldwater Cove, Jonas became the child everyone whispered about, the child who shouldn't have been there. Because when the storms rolled in and the windows rattled with the cries of the wind, Jonas would rise from his sleep, walk to the front porch, and murmur into the darkness, "Something's coming," and something always did. 3 weeks after Jonas arrived, the townsfolk started to notice. It began with the birds. Father Monroe of St. Lyle's Chapel was the first to speak up. Not in a sermon, but in hushed conversation over coffee at Mabel's diner. He said flocks of blackbirds were circling the boy's house at dusk. Not flying, circling. Silent, in slow spirals, before scattering into the treetops without a sound. That Sunday, Eleanor brought Jonas to church. The air was still when they entered. Everyone turned to look. Not out of curiosity, but something closer to awe or dread. The boy stood beside Eleanor in a clean coat and polished boots, but he didn't blink. He stared up at the crucifix like he could see something no one else could. When the congregation bowed their heads to pray, Jonas stepped forward, quietly, slowly. His little boots echoed on the wooden floor. He climbed the pulpit. Gasps rippled through the pews, and Father Monroe began to rise but stopped mid-motion, as if his body froze. Jonas stood at the edge of the altar, tiny hands gripping the wood, and said calmly, "Tomorrow, before noon, the Diamond Hollow mine will split. 10 will be buried." Silence, heavy and unreal. Miners in the crowd chuckled nervously. The mine was stable, solid rock. No one believed him, except for foreman Blake Sullivan, who had lost a brother to a tunnel collapse decades ago. He listened. The next day, at 11:46 a.m., the western tunnel ruptured. A methane pocket ignited. 10 men died. 3 of the survivors had left only because Blake insisted they go check the ventilation line. When the news broke, the town didn't cheer. It didn't grieve. It watched Jonas. Watched how he sat silently on the Whitmore's porch as the funeral bells rang. Watched how he looked toward the church and whispered, "That wasn't the last one." By the following week, Jonas had become less of a child and more of an omen. People didn't look him in the eye anymore. They crossed streets. They lowered their voices around him. They left fruit and bread on the Whitmore porch without a word. But Eleanor, despite the fear creeping into her neighbors' faces, only held him closer. "He's just a boy," she whispered. "Just a boy with a wound too deep to show." That Sunday, Jonas did not walk to the pulpit. He didn't speak during prayer. He sat stiffly beside Thomas, staring at a man 3 rows ahead, Mr. Benjamin Harlan, the wealthy owner of the Diamond Hollow Mining Company. Benjamin had made his fortune through the backs of the laborers. He was known for bribes, for fraud, and for hiring men desperate enough to ignore danger. But in the church, he was always loud in his worship and generous with his tithe. Until that day. At the end of the service, as the bells rang and people turned to leave, Jonas stood. He pointed straight at Benjamin and said, clear as ice, "He will be dead by Tuesday." Gasps again. Benjamin laughed, though his lips trembled. "That boy ought to be spanked," he muttered. But on Tuesday morning, just after dawn, Benjamin's carriage was found upside down in the river gully outside town. The horses had bolted during the night. Witnesses claimed they heard screams before the crash, but no one investigated. The town didn't want to know more. That evening, the church was quiet. Father Monroe sat with his hands folded tightly, muttering Latin verses with shaking lips. Outside, Jonas stood still in the garden, eyes fixed on the fading sun, whispering something no one could hear. Thomas finally asked him, "Jonas, how did you know?" Jonas looked up at him with something that wasn't quite sadness, and not quite pride either. "I just listened," he said, "and it told me." Thomas shivered. "Who to? Well, you?" Jonas turned to the trees swaying under a rising wind. "The water," he said. "It never stops talking. Rumors rot faster than fruit, and in Coldwater Cove, fear had begun to ferment. They called him the drowned one now, behind closed doors, in whispers too afraid to be heard by ears not meant to listen. Mothers crossed themselves when he passed. Children peeked from behind curtains. The name Jonas was spoken the way one might speak of a curse. The Whitmores tried to protect him. They took him out of Sunday service, stopped answering the door, and homeschooled him with borrowed books and kindness. But Jonas had already left the world of normal things. Something had changed in him since Benjamin Harlan's death. He spoke less, slept little. Sometimes Thomas found him out back at midnight, standing barefoot in the frost, humming low to the sea. The townsfolk thought they saw shadows near him that moved when he didn't, that when the church bells rang, he'd tilt his head like listening to a deeper sound buried beneath them. And then came the second prediction. Not in a church, in the wind. It was the night the storm hit, fierce and black, with lightning that cracked open the sky like God was trying to speak. Eleanor had tucked Jonas into bed, but just after midnight, he walked to the Whitmores' front door and opened it wide. The wind screamed through the house like 1,000 unseen mouths, and Jonas whispered to it, "The chapel's tower will fall before morning." Thomas ran to him. "Jonas, what are you doing?" Jonas didn't look at him. His eyes were locked onto the dark line of trees beyond the yard. "It's too heavy," he said. "The cross doesn't want to hold any more." By sunrise, half of St. Lyle's chapel roof had caved in. The bell tower had collapsed during the storm. No one had been hurt. By sheer luck, Father Monroe had moved all services to the basement that week due to floor repairs. But the whispers now took a new form. Was he divine or possessed? They didn't know what he was. They only knew one thing for sure. He was never wrong. By the next week, the town had made up its mind. Jonas wasn't gifted. He wasn't special. He was a curse, and curses in Coldwater Cove had to be named out loud, or they festered like rot in the bones of the town. It was the widow Callahan who lit the match. During a town meeting at the old Grange Hall, she stood up, trembling, and pointed at the Whitmores seated quietly in the back. Her voice cracked through the silence like thunder on dry leaves. "He brought it here," she rasped. "Since that boy washed up, death has clung to this town like seaweed to a grave." Thomas rose to object, but he was drowned out by a ripple of murmurs. "He's a vessel. Something unnatural. It ain't the boy, it's what's inside him." That night, Father Monroe visited the Whitmore home under cover of darkness. He didn't bring scripture or comfort. He brought a worn leather satchel, thick with old salt-stained pages and exorcism rites long unused. "I need to see the boy," he said to Thomas. "It's time we test the spirit inside him." Thomas refused. Eleanor stood between them, eyes fierce, voice steady. "He's a child, not a devil." But Father Monroe's eyes were hollow. "He is something, Mrs. Whitmore, and I fear it will take more from us before it stops." The next day, townspeople left branches tied with string on the Whitmore's gate, an old sign of spiritual cleansing, but also a warning. Jonas didn't react. Instead, he sat at the window for hours, sketching something over and over in chalk. When Thomas finally looked, he felt the blood drain from his face. The child had drawn the same figure 37 times, a crude outline of a man in a long coat, hanging upside down by one leg from a wooden crossbeam. And in the final drawing, the figure was burning. Jonas looked up at him and spoke calmly. "They're going to try to take me." The town smelled like smoke for days after. They called it an accident, said the wind blew too hard, caught the old dry wood of the chapel's roof where the bell tower had collapsed. They said lightning must have found what the storm hadn't finished. But Thomas knew better. So did Jonas. The chapel burned in silence. No fire bells were rung. No one tried to stop it. They stood at the edge of the square, faces illuminated by flame, and watched the only church in Coldwater Cove crumble into ember and ash. Jonas didn't speak as the flames climbed higher. He stood barefoot in the Whitmore's yard, head tilted to one side like he was listening again, not to the fire, but beneath it. "They're scared," he whispered to no one. "They think if they burn where I stood, they'll burn what I am." Thomas crouched beside him. "Jonas, what are you?" The boy blinked, slowly. "I don't know," he said, "but they do." That night, Eleanor couldn't sleep. She sat on the porch, shotgun in her lap, staring out into the shadows between the trees. She'd seen the way Father Monroe watched Jonas now, not with fear, but with resolve, the kind of resolve that led men to call fire holy. And when Eleanor finally drifted off, she awoke to find Jonas gone. They found him at dawn, in front of the charred skeleton of the chapel, kneeling in the ash. Around him were 12 circles, drawn with something dark smeared thick into the ground. At first, they thought it was paint. It wasn't. The doctor who examined the scene never gave an official report, only said, "It was blood. Animal, I hope." Jonas refused to explain, but he said one thing as he was led away, back to the Whitmore's home. "They need me to be the monster. It's easier than listening. The town couldn't burn Jonas, not yet, but it could prepare the kindling." After the chapel's ashes cooled, Father Monroe called a secret gathering inside an abandoned barn once used to salt fish. It sat half-collapsed on the edge of the cove, but the crucifix was still nailed to the back wall, charred but untouched. He called it the Circle of Sanctity. But it was no prayer group. 10 men, 2 women, all seated in a ring of lanterns. At the center, Father Monroe, red-eyed, hollow-voiced, clutching an old leather-bound Bible that had long since been rewritten by his own hand. "We are not casting judgment on a child," he said. "We are casting light upon the thing that walks in his skin. He spoke of demons that mimic innocence, of omens, of false prophets sent to mislead the righteous. And then he gave them each a task, anointing the Whitmore's doorstep with holy water, watching the house at night, noting any unnatural behavior. By week's end, the Whitmores felt surrounded. A different man stood near their yard every evening. Windows rattled with thrown pebbles. Chanted prayers drifted in through the floorboards at midnight. Still, Jonas remained calm. Until the dreams began. Ellen awoke to find Jonas sobbing, clutching his pillow. His voice was hoarse, as if he'd been screaming in sleep. When she asked what he saw, he said, "They were drowning me, but the water was made of names, and none of them were mine." Thomas, shaken, confronted Monroe in the street. "You're scaring a child." Monroe didn't blink. "He's not a child. You just think he is. That's how it deceives." The next Sunday, a rumor spread like a flame through Coldwater Cove. An exorcism was coming. Not in private, not with permission, but in the open, at the center of the town square. As Monroe put it to the circle, "If it dies under holy touch, then it never was a boy to begin with." And somewhere, deep in the night, Jonas drew a new image in the dirt. A man's face, split in two, one side smiling, the other melting. The town square had never been so full. Not for a wedding, not for a funeral, not even for the spring harvest. They came not with pitchforks or torches, but with rosaries, salt, holy water, and tightly clutched Bibles. Some came in silence, others came singing, but all came with one thing on their breath, the belief that they were about to confront something unholy. At the center of it all was a makeshift altar, 2 wooden crates stacked under a linen cloth. Behind it, Father Monroe stood in full ceremonial vestments, white robes stained faintly with the soot of the burned chapel. And in front of him, under the gaze of nearly 80 souls, stood Jonas. Eleanor screamed as they pulled him away that morning. They came early, 4 men from Monroe's circle, all wearing crosses around their necks like armor. Thomas tried to fight, but was thrown to the floor and held at gunpoint while they dragged Jonas from his bed. Now, in the center of Coldwater Cove, the boy stood barefoot on the frost-bitten ground, wrapped in a wool coat too large for his frame. His lips didn't move, his eyes didn't rise, but his presence, even in stillness, terrified them. Monroe raised a small brass cross and stepped forward. "We begin in his name." He touched the boy's forehead. Whispers rose from the crowd. Then, a sound, not from Jonas, from beneath the earth. A distant, low-pitched rumble, like a groan swallowed by miles of dirt. The ground trembled. Lanterns flickered. A child cried out. Somewhere, a horse broke from its tie and ran. Monroe hesitated. Just for a second, Jonas looked up, his voice clear, cutting through the wind like a blade. "Don't touch me again, or the hill will open." Silence. Then the bell atop the courthouse, untouched for decades, rang once on its own. The crowd screamed. People backed away. A woman fainted. But Monroe didn't stop. His hands sound, hook, but he raised the cross again. And Jonas said softly, "You want to see hell, Father?" "Step closer." Monroe's hand shook as he brought the cross down again, pressing it firmly to Jonas's chest. The boy didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. He just whispered, 3 feet down, the fire waits." That's when it happened. With a sharp crack, like bones breaking, the ground beneath the wooden altar split down the middle. A jagged line tore through the frozen earth, running straight through Monroe's feet. He stumbled back, dropping the cross. Steam hissed up from the fissure like breath from something ancient and alive. The crowd panicked. Some fell to their knees, screaming prayers. Others ran, scattering across the square like insects under light. The air grew hot, the earth quaked again, and the church bell, that damn bell, rang once more. Only Jonas remained still, silent, watching. Monroe collapsed to his knees, his white robes now gray with ash. He stared at the crack in the ground and began to mutter uncontrollably. Not of God, not of man, shadows in his image. Thomas broke through the crowd, bruised and breathless, and rushed to Jonas. He scooped him into his arms and ran as people parted before them, unsure whether to stop him or fall to their faces in fear. By the time they reached the edge of town, the quake had stopped. The fissure lay quiet now, but something inside it still pulsed, a heat, a hum, like the dying heartbeat of an angry god. Father Monroe was taken to his home that night. He didn't speak, didn't sleep, just rocked in his chair and stared at the crucifix on his wall, whispering, "We invited it, we named it, now it won't leave." And in the Whitmore house, Jonas lay curled under a blanket, pale and silent. Eleanor asked if he was okay. He only replied, "You should leave soon, before they try again." Outside, the wind picked up, cold and wet and full of the sound of distant chanting. When the letter arrived, it smelled faintly of cloves and old leather. It bore the seal of the American Society for Psychological and Religious Studies, a quiet, government-backed institution that claimed to explore the line between faith and illness. Very few knew it existed. Fewer still were willing to admit they'd written to it. But someone in Coldwater Cove had. 2 weeks after the square split open, a train rolled into the northern station under fog. From it stepped Dr. Aldous Shaw, tall, formal, with silver-rimmed spectacles and a leather case held tightly in one gloved hand. He was not a priest. He was not a scientist. He was something in between, a man trained to explain the unexplainable, and if necessary, to contain it. He spoke with precision and calm. His voice was steady, almost soothing, the kind of voice made for convincing broken men they weren't crazy. He introduced himself to the Whitmores as a friend of the state, promised confidentiality, promised help. Thomas didn't trust him, but Eleanor, tired and desperate, allowed him in. He observed Jonas first, silently. The boy never looked at him. He just traced patterns in the blanket while the doctor took notes. Dr. Shaw began slowly. Drawings, word games, memory tests. Jonas refused most of them. But then came the first exchange. Shaw placed a photograph of a clock tower in front of Jonas. "What time will it break?" he asked. Jonas blinked slowly. "You already know." Shaw paused. "Humor me." Jonas leaned in and whispered something inaudible. Shaw went pale. Later, Eleanor asked what he said. Dr. Shaw stared at his hands and whispered, "He told me the minute and the name of the man who would be beneath it." That night, Shaw sat in his rented room, recording thoughts into a wire device. Subject appears to possess precognitive abilities paired with an unusual disassociation from SESI, elfhood, possible trauma-induced hyperreceptivity to pattern and probability. But at the end of the recording, Shaw said something more quietly. "I've never met a child who made me afraid before. It was hidden behind the library, a dusty guest chamber with no windows, mirrors on 3 sides, and a single chair in the center. Dr. Shaw called it his reflection room. He told Eleanor it helped children untangle themselves from fear. He told himself it helped him see the truth behind their eyes. Jonas was led in, barefoot, silent. The door was shut gently but firmly. Shaw sat across from him, notebook in lap. "Jonas, we're going to play a game," he said. The boy said nothing. "These mirrors show you what others see, but I want to know what you see." Jonas finally turned, gazing into the glass. His voice came low. "There's someone else in the room." Shaw straightened. "Who?" Jonas pointed, not at a reflection, at a corner, empty, but cold as if it breathed. "She doesn't blink," Jonas said. Then he looked Shaw dead in the eyes. "And neither do you, when you're lying." Shaw flinched. He changed the tactic. "Let's try the metronome," he said, winding the brass pendulum. The clicking echoed like footsteps on hollow bone. As the seconds ticked, Jonas's head drooped. Shaw leaned forward. "Tell me where you came from," he whispered. Jonas mumbled. The words were old, not English, not anything Shaw recognized. A dialect from before records, before language was owned. "What does it mean?" Jonas smiled faintly. "The sea isn't a place. It's a door." Then the mirrors shattered. All at once. Shards flew like birds set loose from cages. One cut Dr. Shaw's cheek. Blood ran like ink. Jonas sat calm amid the wreckage, glass glinting around his bare feet. Shaw backed away. Outside, he scribbled in panic. "Delusions are not internal. Stimulus appears external. Language is unregistered. Psychic phenomenon real and reactive. Proceed with extreme caution." That night, Shaw received a telegram. A fire had broken out at the St. Elwyn Clock Tower in Boston. A man, named Henry Droll, had died beneath falling iron. Exactly as Jonas had whispered. The time of death, 4:17 p.m. The same number scrawled into the doctor's notebook the day before. The drawings started the next morning. Jonas sat quietly in the old sunroom, where Eleanor had set up a table with crayons, paper, and a warm glass of milk. She needed to distract him, keep things normal. But what he drew was anything but normal. Not stick figures, not childish flowers or crooked suns. No, Jonas's hands moved like he was copying blueprints. Diagrams, geometries, faces, unsmiling, detailed, eyes too real. Eleanor leaned over his shoulder. "Who's that, sweetheart?" she asked gently. Jonas pointed. "This one's Mr. Avery. He works at the docks. He's going to fall between the train cars today." She blinked. "Jonas, that's not something to say. It's not saying. It's remembering forward." Later that afternoon, the station master reported a man named Avery crushed between freight car couplings. 4:17 p.m. Again. The next drawing was worse. A building. White church walls, shattered stained glass, flames. In the corner, Jonas had drawn a woman. She looked like Eleanor. She took the drawing, folded it, and hid it in her apron pocket. That evening, she confronted Dr. Shaw. "He's getting worse," she said. Shaw calmly stirred his tea. "No, Mrs. Wright. He's getting clearer. He's predicting real deaths, and now he's drawing me. Dead. What are you doing to him?" Shaw smiled faintly. "He isn't seeing death. He's tracing the outline of divine motion. We just happen to be in the path of it." Eleanor's heart raced. "You said you were helping him." "I am. You see tragedy. I see transcendence." Later that night, Eleanor entered the reflection room when no one was watching. She opened Shaw's locked drawer with a kitchen knife. Inside, dozens of sketches, scrawled pages, and pinned notes. Every major death in the region since Jonas arrived. Every one predicted before it happened. At the center of the corkboard, a photograph of Jonas. Below it, subject P. Haze 3. Initiation, August 17. She froze. That was 5 days away. Then she noticed a small wax seal tucked inside the folder, pressed with the shape of an eye, surrounded by waves. That's when she realized Shaw wasn't the only one studying Jonas. Eleanor waited until the household was asleep. Then she walked into the cellar. It wasn't fear that guided her anymore. It was rage. Rage that this man had kept secrets, that Jonas was a subject, not a child, and that behind his soft words, Dr. Shaw was only a mask for something far older and colder. She placed the wax seal on the table and studied it again. An eye surrounded by ocean waves, not just a symbol. It felt ancient. It seemed to pulse when touched. In the morning, Eleanor took the trolley to Plymouth Town Library, 30 miles south. A storm was already brewing off the coast, but she didn't care. She needed to know what Shaw had dragged into their home. In the dusty archives, she searched every symbol registry, occult collection, maritime record, and 19th century lodge directory. And finally, in a book titled Esoteric Societies of the New Coast, she found it. The eye and wave seal belonged to the Third Order of Maritime Prophets, a forgotten sect from the 1700s. Formed by excommunicated missionaries and mystics from New England, they believed that prophets could be born from salt and sacrifice, chosen by the sea to deliver messages of divine judgment. They were known for isolating children who heard voices from the tides, then cleansing their minds to keep the messages pure. Every record ended the same: child found, prophecies delivered, subject relocated, vessel preserved. Eleanor clutched the pages, hands trembling. Jonas wasn't sick. He wasn't haunted. He was being used. Back in the town, the rain began falling fast. Thunder shook the Wrights' cottage as Eleanor burst in, soaked and frantic. Shaw was sitting at the dining table, as if expecting her. "Ah," he said, standing calmly. "You know now." "You're one of them," she spat. "The Third Order." He nodded solemnly. "We do not harm him, Mrs. Wright. We protect what the world would be to Eerie, your boy is not just a prophet. He is the last vessel before the flood, and the waters are already rising." Eleanor backed away, heart thudding. This wasn't just about one child anymore. It was about the end of something. And Jonas was the beginning. Eleanor didn't sleep that night. The storm outside battered the windows with wind and sea mist, and inside her soul felt just as wrecked. Every time she looked at Jonas, who now lay curled beneath blankets humming an old hymn in a language she didn't recognize, her heart cracked. He was still her boy. But what lived inside him wasn't. At 2:17 a.m., Eleanor crept out again. This time, she wasn't heading to the library or chapel. She walked straight to Captain Harrow's boathouse. He was the only man in town who had once spoken out against the old religious groups along the coast, the cults disguised as Christian healers, the orders who took in children and sent back ashes. His daughter had vanished in 1879. Harrow never forgave the sea or the church. When Eleanor knocked on the door, Harrow opened it with a loaded shotgun and a stare that saw straight through her. "I need your help," she said. "I know," he replied. "I've seen the lights in your house, and the boy. He's not right." Eleanor stepped inside and explained everything. Shaw, the order, the prophecies, the seal. Harrow listened in silence, knuckles white around his pipe. When she finished, he lit a match and said 4 words. "They're bringing the flood." According to Harrow, the Third Order was planning a public sacrifice, a symbolic death to complete the prophecy cycle. Jonas would die, burned at sea in a decoy body to fulfill some twisted vision from their scrolls. Then the real boy would be taken inland, likely erased, mind wiped clean and turned into a vessel for the next revelation. And if they failed, the Order believed the ocean itself would rise. Eleanor wanted to laugh, but outside the tide had crept higher than she'd ever seen in July. They had 9 days until the next full moon. That's when the ritual would happen. Together, Eleanor and Harrow made a plan to fake compliance and then betray the order from within. But someone was listening from the shore, a cloaked figure watching the boathouse. Watching them. The next morning brought silence, unnatural silence. Not a single gull cried over the harbor, not a single bell tolled from the town chapel. It was as if the very air held its breath. Eleanor returned home just after dawn, her boots soaked and muddy. She hadn't noticed the trail she left behind, but someone had. From across the field behind the parsonage, a man in a black wool coat stood motionless amid the tall, dead grass. His beard was white, thick, and unnaturally neat. His eyes were covered by round, dark glasses, though the sun was barely a mist behind gray clouds. He held a silver walking stick, not to walk with, but to warn, because wherever he stepped, animals fled. He was one of the gentlemen of the order, the upper echelon of the religious circle who believed Jonas was not a child, but a vessel, not an innocent, but a bridge. They called him Father Maccabeus, though no one in Black Hollow knew his real name. He had arrived with the storm, and he brought others. As Eleanor helped Jonas eat his porridge, still humming, still speaking in those strange fragments of Aramaic and something far older, she saw them. 3 men, standing perfectly still across the road, watching the house, no badges, no movement, just polished boots and hands behind their backs, waiting. Jonas turned his head slowly toward the window and whispered, "They already buried me once." Then he laughed. Eleanor's hands shook. The plan she made with Harrow felt paper-thin now. She hadn't told Thomas yet. The town would never believe her. The preacher would think she'd gone mad. Shaw had vanished again. There was no one left to trust, except Harrow. And maybe Jonas himself. But Jonas had begun to speak of dreams where the ocean talked back, where he stood in a circle of robed men and chanted into fire. The watchers remained outside all day, never moving. And when night fell, one of them placed a white envelope on the front step. Inside, a photograph of Jonas asleep, taken from inside the house. They waited until midnight. Eleanor, Harrow, and Jonas sat by candlelight in the root cellar, the boy drawing circles on the dirt floor with a shard of chalk he refused to part with. Above them, the house groaned, timber shifting like bones in pain. Outside, the watchers were still stationed across the street. Harrow had retrieved something from his hidden past, a sealed wooden case lined in black velvet. Inside lay a surgical kit, not for healing, but for ritual. Carved handles, bone scissors, a scalpel so thin it could slice without touch. Eleanor stared, eyes wide. "You said you were a doctor," she whispered. "I was," Harrow replied, "before I met them." Jonas hummed softly, then said, "They'll take the blood first, then the tongue, then the heart. It must be clean." Eleanor gasped. "What? Who told you that?" "I dreamed it, but I wasn't me." Harrow opened a book, not one from any known library. Its pages were yellowed, the text handwritten in some forgotten tongue, symbols like thorns and arrows, inked in what looked disturbingly like dried blood. At the bottom of one page, a drawing, a child encircled by robed figures, suspended above a pit of smoke. "This isn't about medicine," Harrow said. "They believe he's the 13th conduit, the last one they need to open the gate." Gate to what? To whatever sleeps beneath this coast. Wind howled above. The cellar door rattled violently. Jonas stood slowly. He looked toward the ceiling and whispered something that froze both adults in place. "They're not waiting. They're already in." A thump echoed from upstairs, then another, a third, closer now. Suddenly, A voice called from the parlor above. "Eleanor, child, why are you hiding from your pastor?" It was Reverend Dalton, but he had drowned 2 nights ago in the salt marsh. Jonas looked at Eleanor and smiled. That's not his voice anymore. Then the candle blew out, and the scratching began beneath the floorboards. The cellar door creaked open, not with violence but with purpose, as though invited by the darkness within. A cold gust spiraled downward, carrying the smell of wet soil and decayed lilies, the scent of funerals long past. Jonas was the first to move, barefoot, silent, walking up the stairs as though under spell. Eleanor reached for him, but Harrow held her back. "If we interrupt," he whispered, "we break the veil. Let him see it through." "See what?" Eleanor wanted to ask, but then they heard chanting. Above them, where the parlor should have been empty, voices, layered, distorted, and hollow, spoke in a language that felt older than wood, older than salt, older than fear itself, and in that cacophony, one voice rose clearer than the rest. It was Jonas. He wasn't speaking English, but they understood him. "She is watching now. The boy is almost ready. The child must see death and choose silence. Only then will the gate open, and the wound heal." Eleanor's fingers tightened on Harrow's arm. "What gate? What wound?" He didn't answer. He was weeping. When they ascended the stairs together, they found the living room transformed. The windows were gone. Where once there was glass, now hung long sheets of oiled cloth, like in a slaughterhouse. The fireplace burned blue. The crucifix above the mantel had melted, forming a warped eye. And Jonas stood in the center, his arms outstretched, wearing a crown of driftwood and teeth. At his feet, the boy, silent, calm, holding a dead bird, its eyes plucked, its wings folded like prayer hands. "They said I was the lamb," Jonas whispered, "but I'm the knife." Harrow stepped forward. "We can still stop this. He's just a child." But from the shadows behind the oiled cloth, figures emerged. Some were barefoot. Some wore masks made of birch bark and fishbone, all of them humming. And then Eleanor noticed the most terrible thing of all. Every figure had the face of someone from town, but each face was smiling the wrong way. The room had become a womb of nightmares, pulsing, hot, and soaked in something that smelled like copper and salt. The figures stepped forward in a slow spiral, moving counterclockwise, as if undoing time itself. Their humming grew louder, no longer musical but mechanical, like bees trapped inside bones. Eleanor clutched the boy and pulled him away from Jonas, whose eyes no longer looked human. His pupils had vanished, his skin had turned translucent. He was mouthing words silently now, lips twitching faster than breath allowed. The boy resisted, not violently, but with a heavy sadness, as if he wanted to stay. His grip on the dead bird remained, its feathers now wilting, curling at the edges like burnt paper. Harrow raised his voice. "Who are you people? What are you doing to this child?" One of the masked figures answered, but the voice didn't match the body. It was high, feminine, and ancient. "We don't do. We restore. The boy is not the first. He is the last." "Last of what?" Eleanor demanded. "The last mirror before the storm." At that moment, the ground beneath them rumbled, a deep, slow quake, like something immense shifting beneath the earth. Cracks split the floorboards in jagged veins, and from those openings seeped cold black mist, thicker than smoke, heavier than water. And the boy began to float, just inches off the floor, but unmistakably lifted by something not of this world. His eyes rolled back. The bird in his hands burst open. No blood, no guts, just a cloud of white moths exploding into the air, circling the room like ash in a whirlwind. Eleanor screamed. Harrow ran forward, but the spiral of followers closed in, chanting now in unison, "Feed the silence, Feed the silence! Feed the silence! The blue fire from the hearth shot upward, licking the ceiling, and for a moment time cracked. They saw, just for an instant, another place, bathed, the room, a coastline, a black sea, a mountain of hands reaching toward a crimson sky. Then it was gone, and Jonas collapsed, limp, burned. The boy fell too. But this time, he wasn't breathing. Morning never came. Not in the way they remembered it. The light that finally cracked through the stained windows of the chapel was gray and colorless, as if the sun itself had died behind the clouds. A stillness draped over the air, a silence that didn't invite peace, but held its breath like a warning. Jonas remained unconscious, his body curled like a child's, skin marked with thin black veins that pulsed faintly under the surface. Harrow had tried to move him during the night, but his limbs were rigid, almost petrified. And the boy, Elijah, they still called him that, though no one dared say it out loud anymore. He lay in the chapel's center, cold, still. His small frame wrapped in Eleanor's shawl, his lips slightly parted, his expression unbearably calm, as if asleep beneath a lake. But Eleanor knew better. He was gone, or at least the part that made him a boy was. "We shouldn't have come here," Harrow muttered, pacing the broken floor. "This town's not on any map. No postal route, no government registry, not even a damn graveyard." "You saw them," Eleanor whispered. "What they did, what they said. They've been waiting for him, maybe for centuries." From outside came the soft patter of ashfall. It wasn't snow. It was lighter, drifting sideways like the world was bleeding dreams. Eleanor glanced at the altar. The townspeople hadn't returned. The followers had vanished like smoke at dawn. No footsteps, no signs, just the faint smell of sulfur and pine. Then, suddenly, Elijah's chest rose, barely, and from his mouth came not a breath, but a whisper. Too soft to understand, but it wasn't gibberish. It was Latin. Harrow stepped closer, recording device in hand. "What did he say?" Eleanor leaned in. Her lips trembled. "Custodes portae nondum dormiunt." Harrow froze. "The gatekeepers haven't fallen asleep yet?" Then, without warning, Elijah opened his ye's. But they weren't his. They were black, veinless, reflective like obsidian. And in that reflection, they saw themselves, buried alive. By mid-afternoon, the fog had thickened into something almost living, not merely hanging in the air, but moving through it. You couldn't see more than a few feet in any direction, and what you could see felt warped. Elongated trees, buildings with strange angles. The church's steeple leaned left, then right, though it hadn't moved in over 100 years. The town of Marrow's Point was collapsing. The air was wet and foul, like breath exhaled from a grave. Street lamps hissed and sparked without flame. Wind moved in pulses, not breezes, but deep inhalations and exhalations, as though the very soil beneath them had become sentient. Dr. Harrow had barricaded himself inside the chapel's vestry, poring through his notes, frantically decoding the Latin phrase Elijah had muttered. But the symbols no longer made sense. Every sentence bled into the next. Whole pages rearranged themselves in his mind. Eleanor stood by the window, watching as the townspeople, those who had vanished the night before, reappeared one by one. But something about them was wrong. They walked in slow loops through the square, not speaking, not blinking, as if caught in some endless, cursed ritual. "Elijah?" she whispered. The boy sat upright now, cross-legged on the chapel floor, staring out the broken glass doors, his eyes still black, his face expressionless. Then he turned to her and spoke, not in Latin this time, in English, clear, hollow. This place was built over a mouth, and now it's waking up. A groan echoed from beneath the chapel. Not wind, not thunder. Something ancient shifting far below. Stone cracking, wood splintering, water rushing. Harrow screamed suddenly from the vestry, smashing his recorder to pieces. "They lied to us. The boy's not a prophet. He's a key." Eleanor backed away from Elijah, now visibly trembling, but the boy didn't move. "They carved the town to keep it quiet, the shapes, the songs, the sacrifices, but it's hungry again." From outside came the tolling of a bell. There was no bell in Marrow's Point, and yet it rang, long, low, and solemn, like a funeral call for something still alive. The chapel doors creaked open, not pushed by hand, but drawn by a pressure shift so subtle it made the flame of every candle flicker backward. Eleanor took a step forward, then stopped, her instinct screaming run, while something deeper whispered, "Stay." Elijah remained motionless, sitting in the center of the chapel like a relic of some lost god. His mouth parted slightly, lips dry, eyes dull but bottomless. Outside, the bell tolled again, louder now, closer. Not just a sound, but a feeling vibrating through the air like a pulse of dread. "You have to leave," Elijah said softly. "You have to leave me behind." "No," Eleanor choked. "I won't abandon you." "You already did," he replied without emotion. "Everyone does. It's how I open." Eleanor's hands trembled. "What do you mean? Open?" He looked up at her with something close to sorrow. "They made me forget because the truth is too much. But it's back now. I was born not to live, but to unlock. And the lock was made from names. Names no man should speak." The stained glass windows behind him pulsed, dimmed, and then cracked. Every child Elijah had predicted the death of. Their faces were now visible in the glass, frozen in screams, silent and watching. Outside, the fog parted slightly. Eleanor glimpsed something massive moving through it, like a structure on legs, impossibly tall, dragging chains behind it. The ground moaned beneath its weight. Dr. Harrow stumbled out of the vestry, bleeding from one eye, clutching a torn page of his notes. "We have to give it what it came for." He pointed to Elijah, wild-eyed. "He's the doorway, not a boy, not even human anymore." The air thickened again. The sound of weeping echoed through the chapel, dozens of voices layered over each other, and then Elijah whispered, "If I say the last name, the one I was made to carry, it comes through." Eleanor reached for him, but her fingers stopped inches from his skin. The heat pouring off his body was inhuman. "Say it!" Harrow shouted. "End this!" Elijah looked at Eleanor. "If I do, you all disappear." Eleanor stepped backward as Elijah rose from the chapel floor. He wasn't standing. He was rising, like something no longer bound by gravity or fear. His feet hovered inches above the stone, arms spread, not in welcome but like a crucifix held aloft for the final ceremony. Outside, the fog had swallowed the coastline. No more gulls, no more bells. Only it remained, the shifting form with chains dragging behind it, growing clearer with every breath. "Elijah," Eleanor whispered. "What's the name?" His mouth moved, but no sound came. And then, Dr. Harrow began to convulse, clutching his head as blood streamed from his ears. "He's saying it," Harrow croaked. "But not in sound, in meaning." From the broken stained glass, the children's images began to melt, dripping like wax from the windows, their faces sliding down the panes. "They told me in the mine," Elijah said, voice split, his and something else layered beneath it. "Buried in the rock. That name was never meant to rise." Eleanor pressed her palms against her ears, but it didn't help. The name wasn't something you could block. It vibrated through the marrow, pressed against the soul. Every candle blew out simultaneously. The chapel turned black. Then came the flash. A brilliant, blinding burst of silver-white light erupted from Elijah's chest. The crucifix above the altar inverted mid-air and crashed to the ground. The earth outside split. Not a quake, but a surgical cut. A wind blasted through the town, pulling everything inward toward the chapel. Leaves, branches, dead birds, prayer books, salt from the sea. Harrow screamed, "It's not a name, it's a summoning. A door doesn't open unless it knows where to go." And then Elijah said it. One word, 3 syllables, never recorded, never repeated. Eleanor felt her nose bleed instantly. Her legs gave out. All the air left the chapel. For a second, just a single moment, everyone disappeared, gone. No breath, no motion, no sound. And then, it all came roaring back. But Elijah wasn't there. Just a small pile of salt on the chapel floor. No boy, no pulse, no footprints. Only silence, and the scent of brine and blood. The town gathered at dusk. Every man, woman, and trembling child stood in the churchyard, silent beneath grey skies that looked too heavy to hold. A bitter wind rolled off the sea, stirring their coats, whispering through the pews dragged outside for the occasion. In the center of the yard stood a closed coffin, pinewood and poorly nailed. No one had been allowed to view the body, not even Eleanor. Dr. Harrow claimed the remains were too fragile, too corrupted by the event. He said the boy had become salt, a holy transformation. But Eleanor knew better. She'd watched Harrow build the effigy. A child-sized form stuffed with sawdust, clothed in Elijah's simple blue wool coat, the one with the frayed sleeves. A perfect replica of innocence. Harrow had dressed it himself, with trembling hands. Then he doused it in kerosene. "He has to die," Harrow muttered, "so the world can be safe, so he can be free." The priest read from a corrupted gospel. Not the Bible, but something older, translated by Harrow from the cave inscriptions below the mine. His voice wavered on strange words, syllables with too many consonants. Then the match was struck. The flames were too eager. They rushed up the coffin like they'd been waiting. People gasped. A few wept. Some fell to their knees and prayed. But not Eleanor. She stood with her back to the fire, looking down the hill where the train tracks bent out of sight, toward Fairhope, a distant seaside town untouched by all this madness. Inside her satchel was a child's hand, gently gripping hers. "You don't speak until we're off the train," she whispered. "You're Samuel now, not Elijah." The boy nodded. He hadn't spoken since the chapel. Not a word, not a whimper, just stared with those eyes like storm clouds over still water. Behind them, the flames danced higher. The villagers believed they were burning a prophet, the doctor bell, if he was saving the world. And Eleanor? She believed in the boy, even if it meant lying to everyone she ever knew. They disappeared into the smoke, the train whistle like a morning scream through the hills. The town of Fairhope lay curled along the cliffs like a cat at rest, quiet, coastal, unremarkable, the kind of place people went to forget things, or hide from them. Eleanor stepped off the train with a false smile stitched tight across her face. She held Samuel's hand firmly. No one questioned the quiet child clinging to her side. He was pale, yes, too still. But this was 1906. A lot of children looked that way. Grief, they assumed. She let them. The boarding house on Hemlock Street was clean, cheap, and blessedly nosy. The owner, Mrs. Redlow, asked everything Eleanor had rehearsed answers for. Recent widow, distant cousin's child, starting over after a tragedy back east. "God bless you," Redlow whispered, patting the boy's head. Elijah didn't flinch. He simply looked past her toward the black water barely visible between the rooftops. The days passed slowly. Eleanor took a job in the town library, quiet and forgettable. She read him storybooks at night, softly, cautiously, watching his face for signs of whatever he was. But the silence didn't last. First, it was the neighbors. One night, the man across the hall woke up screaming. He claimed he'd seen a figure standing in the corner of his room. A small boy, dripping wet, mouth sewn shut. Then the shopkeeper's wife began sleepwalking to the sea, always the same time, always barefoot, always whispering one word: return. And then came the chalk drawings. Samuel hadn't spoken once, but Eleanor found markings on the walls near his bed, spirals, grids, symbols etched so deeply into the plaster they looked carved by nails. The same patterns Harrow once found in the sacred caves beneath Grey Hill. She confronted him. "Did you draw these?" The boy looked at her, just looked, and in that moment, Eleanor felt it again, that awful pressure in the air, like being deep underwater, or buried alive. "I don't remember," he whispered finally. "But someone does." Eleanor froze. He hadn't just spoken. He had spoken with two voices, one layered atop the other, one hers, the other something vast and echoing. The boy was remembering, and something was remembering through him. It happened on the night of the full moon, 3 months after they arrived in Fairhope. The sea was louder than usual, clawing at the cliffs like it was trying to drag the land backward. The town held its breath. Eleanor couldn't sleep. Samuel had stood at the window for hours, watching the moon like it was whispering something only he could hear. At midnight, he turned to her and said softly, "It's time." She didn't argue. They walked in silence, through sleeping streets, past shuttered windows and flickering gas lamps, toward the cliffs. The boy led, barefoot, white nightshirt fluttering like a sail in the wind. At the edge, he stopped. "The memory is awake now," he whispered. "It wants to return." Eleanor's voice cracked. "Return to what?" He looked back at her. For the first time in months, he smiled. "Where I was born. Not who, not when, but where." Behind them, in the darkness, a slow trail of townsfolk began to gather. Sleepwalkers, silent, eyes open but unseeing, children, elders, the librarian, Mrs. Redlow, all of them drawn by the same unseen call. Samuel stepped forward, right to the edge, and then he simply leaned. Eleanor screamed, lunging, too late. His body disappeared into the black sea below. No splash, no sound, just gone. But there was no time to grieve. From the cliffs, smoke began to rise. The town was burning, not Fairhope, Grey Hill. Back east, what little remained of the church, the psychologist's home, the orphanage, engulfed. Back at the lab, a single photograph curled in flame, the first image of Samuel in Harrow's file. But as it blackened, something strange was revealed beneath the burn layer, an older photo, sepia-toned from the 1800s. The same boy, same face, same hollow eyes, labeled Patient Number 0, Whitaker Institute, 1833. Eleanor, still at the cliff's edge, didn't cry. She stared at the sea, waiting. And just before dawn, she saw him again, standing on the water, not in it. Silent, arms stretched wide like a cross. But he was not a child anymore. And in the depths behind him, 1,000 faces waited beneath the waves.